Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to you today, an author who has literally written the book on whistleblowing. Tom Mueller, a 25 plus year veteran investigative journalist. He is a New York Times bestseller. His book, Extra Virginity, discussed the olive oil industry in Italy. And I think that he may tell us more about that, but I think that's what prompted him to decide to spend 7 years researching whistleblowing and interviewing hundreds of whistleblowers and their counsel, which resulted in a book which was published last year called Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. It's a cultural history of whistleblowing and fraud, and includes amazing descriptions of many whistleblower stories, which I think contain a lot of nuggets for all of us to learn from. So, Tom, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Mary, and thank you to our host for giving us the opportunity to talk about whistleblowing, something that's very, very much in the news these days. But I think largely misunderstood by the people who haven't actually come very close to the whistleblowing phenomenon. There are lots and lots of misapprehensions about what whistleblowing is that it'll be interesting to talk through. Yes, I've been an investigative journalist for the last, as you say, quarter century, my goodness. I started off looking at fraud in food and particularly olive oil. And that was the first time when I realized that really to get the true story on wrongdoing, you need to go inside organizations. You need to have an insider who can tell you what's really going on, because obviously organizations that are doing bad things try to cover that up. And with the growth of secrecy as a sort of a legal right in many cases, with the growth of a kind of cult of money, cult of the insiders having the right to sort of kind of do what they want despite public good. You really need to have a voice from the inside saying, wait, this is actually what's going on. So after food fraud, I stumbled into whistleblowing. In fact, the teamwork between the whistleblower and the whistleblower attorney, which is how I met Mary and many of her colleagues, is fundamental to understanding not only how whistleblowing and whistleblower laws work, but also for me as a journalist to get inside the heads of whistleblowers, because sometimes whistleblowers themselves, and Mary, you representing many high-level whistleblowers, I think you'll agree, sometimes they don't have a full perspective on what's going on. Many whistleblowers are shocked when they come forward with what they consider to be very important information to serve their firm, to help their firm to prevent a catastrophic loss of the reputation, or indeed to avoid prosecution. And suddenly the whistleblower retaliation mechanism is set off. And many whistleblowers, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, many whistleblowers told me, I hate the word whistleblowing. I was just doing my job. Why do I need a special title for just doing my job? So that was what led me to look more deeply at whistleblowing, but also to look at the dynamics of the organization around the whistleblowers and the kind of almost biological gut reactions that occur in the coworkers and the bosses of whistleblowers that quite often confound the whistleblowers and confound people who are looking from the outside.
Thanks, Tom. I want to sort of zoom back for a minute and talk a little bit about the audience that we have today and what we're charged with talking about. The Integrity at Work Week conference is dealing with ethics in the workplace, new challenges and opportunities for employers. But our day in particular is tasked with talking the topic of putting statements into practice, key components of an ethical workplace. So I translate that to mean we got to walk the walk, not just talk the talk of compliance, ethics, and support. what is very fascinating to me about this audience is that Integrity at Work is an amazing organization that helps corporations to understand, and they basically take an integrity at work pledge. So I'm to basically make sure that they are learning and protecting staff who speak up. So we have a very educated audience today. I would also like to say that, in a bit of a spoiler alert, I was on a conference earlier today in which the International Bar Association, in conjunction with the Government Accountability Project in the United States, has done a survey of all of the world's whistleblower laws, and has said that Ireland sits there is among the upper echelon, close to the top, and unfortunately are not near Canada, which is at the bottom near Lebanon. So I just wanted to talk about, just frame it for us, that we're talking to a very sophisticated audience who knows whistleblowing very well. So with that backdrop, I've watched your amazing TED Talk, and I encourage others to do so. One of the things that you say is, you say, whistleblowing is a critical act of a healthy democracy. And for our discussion today, I wanted to turn it to say, isn't whistleblowing a critical act of a healthy business? So I was hoping we could talk about, for these employers here who are already pretty sophisticated, can we demystify a little bit more about why, when someone blows the whistle, they shouldn't be concerned, and why, in fact, these people may be healthy to the organization?
Indeed, and you're quite right to point out that our audience is probably far ahead of the curve in terms of understanding whistleblowing. I think there's no question. I mean, a number of important academic research projects have shown that the vast majority of whistleblowers, first of all, surface their concerns internally before going externally. They do not do it in order to harm their organization, but typically with the idea of helping their organization. These are not the enemy in most cases. Obviously, there are exceptions, but the general principles of whistleblowing, again, many people feel it is their duty as an employee. In some cases, their sworn duty as a nuclear safety engineer, or as an investigator, or as a doctor or a lawyer. It's their duty to surface what they consider to be wrongdoing. So seeing whistleblowers as a healthy voice of warning rather than an internal challenge, taking it professionally as one of the key ways in which an organization can, in fact, avoid a big black eye, if not worse, rather than a personal, visceral challenge to one's own authority. Those are the things that being aware of the typical whistleblower reaction and the typical whistleblower retaliation playbook, and the very human instincts. And one of the things that I discussed in that TED Talk, after all of the time that I've spent with whistleblowers, and with all of the sympathy, deep sympathy that I feel, and I think if you read my book, you'll see that I'm very much on their side, I still catch myself thinking now and then, yeah, but they turned on their own. I mean, this is a very, very deep human emotion of, loyalty and obedience. These are very deep-seated things, and they have their place in our businesses and in our society, but they can be catastrophically dangerous when taken to extremes. And I think the whistleblowing, again, the whistleblower as a voice of justice, a voice of openness, the voice of sharing information and getting different views, is a critical course corrector for avoiding groupthink, and which can really lead to a steep fall off a cliff.
Yeah, I think for the benefit of this audience in particular, your point that it's almost reflexive, that when a company, which is made up of individuals, is faced with a whistleblower, there's almost what one of my friends had said is an autoimmune response to expel that person from the corporate body, when in fact our biggest our point of advocacy is that they're really the healthy bacteria that keeps a company healthy. I do want to pause for a minute and talk a little bit. You referenced the research. During Integrity at Work Week, we will be hearing from Professor Kyle Welch, who's a business school professor at George Washington University, who did a really important study that confirms everything we're saying here, which is that they looked at data from Navex Global, one of the largest providers of internal compliance and hotline systems, and they basically found that companies who have whistleblowers hotlines that are ringing off the hook are much healthier than those who do not, which is sort of counterintuitive. You would think that if he's running off the hook, you have a lot of problems, but in fact, they liken it to being the parent of a teenager. If they're talking to you, you can do something about it. So what it said is that companies with whistleblowing hotlines where people feel safe to speak up have fewer lawsuits against them, fewer government enforcement actions. The ones that do occur settle for far less. So I think those are the things we want companies to internalize, to say that it's not just us that are telling you that their whistleblowers are the CEO's best friend or good for you, but that the data actually backs you up. One thing I just wanted to get your thoughts on, Tom, is that there's been a big movement with compliance and ethics officers, who I think are whistleblowers' biggest allies now, to help sort of bring this message to the boardroom, to the C-suite. There's a marvelous social behavioral scientist by the name of Christian Hunt, who is trying to translate the importance of whistleblowing into business speak. And he says whistleblowers are forward indicators of risk, sort of the canaries in the coal mine. Do you have an example you want to share with us where you feel like a whistleblower is particularly helpful as a forward indicator of risk?
I think that a number of cases that I look at in my book are perfect examples of how, whistleblowers are simply surfacing something that sooner or later is going to come a cropper. One of my favorite examples is in the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Eastern Washington in the United States, where all of the plutonium for the U.S. nuclear arsenal was produced until 1987. And the horrible wastes left over from that are still being dealt with. Now, this is a massive ecological environmental threat. And I think Hanford, apart from Washington, D.C., is probably the highest density of whistleblowing in the world. There are hundreds of whistleblowers over time that have blown the whistle on potentially catastrophic dangers. And two that I got to know quite well at Hanford, Walt Tomasidis and Donna Bushy, two very principled nuclear safety engineers, both very, very different in backgrounds, very different in politics. One's hard right, one's fairly hard left, but they both saw as their duty, sworn duty as a nuclear safety engineer, to avoid a catastrophic criticality. In other words, a mushroom cloud over their work site. That's one of their sworn duties, apart from their duty to society. Now, they went out of their way, and both of them, unfortunately, essentially terminated their careers in the long term by pushing internally, again, in their corporation, then going to the regulator, which is the Department of Energy, and then eventually, when that didn't work, going to lawyers and to the press. But they did everything they could internally and with regulators first to surface something that, if it wasn't addressed, we might well have had a catastrophic nuclear accident. The kind of accident that could have rendered large parts of the northwest of the United States uninhabitable. We're not talking about a small event here. So these are people who, and bizarrely, because even though they were completely proven right and vindicated in their lawsuits that they eventually brought, they no longer work in the field. They're no longer welcome. Again, this is both, they did a good service for society, but also for their company. I mean, think of what would have happened if you had been, Bechtel and company had been in charge when the mushroom cloud went up. That would not have been good news for them, no matter how they spin that. It would not have been good news for the Department of Energy regulators who were on call at that time. So, they were certainly forward indicators of risk, of extreme risk, and knowingly sacrificed their careers to stop it. So what we need to have is a wider acceptance within organizations that these naysayers, if you will, these people who have a different view from the group, may well be vital in getting a broader perspective and averting disaster.
I love your point on the broader perspective, because we're in a time of so much research about the importance of diversity and inclusion and having multiple voices in the boardroom and elsewhere, women, people of color, veterans, you know, the whole color of what makes our planet so vibrant. And I think maybe thinking about whistleblowers in that way as just one more voice that you need to include in this sort of new panoply of diversity, I think might be a good way. We're doing so much diversity training right now. It just strikes me that they are also a victimized class.
Absolutely, they're definitely a victimized class, and also, you know, business people like to talk about disruption, talk about, you know, total transparency, extreme transparency, radical transparency. Well, that's what whistleblowers are. They're disruptive, they're challenging, they're radically transparent. What happens to one's theories when someone actually comes forward and says, wait, this is illegal. Look here, see? And they could be right, and they could save you a lot. They could be wrong. That's not the issue. And we can get into this, but motivations and even ultimately correctness, factual correctness about the seriousness of the allegation, the whistleblower allegations, shouldn't be a barrier to embracing the whistleblower's message. Because again, like you say, it's an inclusive and broader whole, and it's incredibly challenging, valuable to have a challenging voice, the devil's advocate.
Absolutely. I thought it'd be interesting because there's an intersection of my world and yours. If we could talk for a moment, I think in sort of doing a post-mortem on a particular whistleblower case that might be instructive to members of our audience of what not to do. So I know you talk about the Theranos debacle in your book. I have the privilege of representing Tyler Schultz, who's one of the two prominent whistleblowers who exposed Theranos. For folks in the audience who don't know the Theranos scandal, there was a woman who fancied herself Steve Jobs, and her name was Elizabeth Holmes, and she became the darling of Silicon Valley, was on the cover of Forbes, and she was going to revolutionize healthcare by doing taking blood tests, hundreds of assays of blood tests from one little finger prick of blood from your finger. And so it was known as Theranos, and it is, to me, a really important example that we can look at for some of the problems. So I want to talk to you about corporate governance and the role that we know that the board played there, and sort of what are some of the red flags that we should have seen. You can certainly tell us about the board. I want to hear more about why that was a red flag. But similarly, there's an interesting siloing that was going on in terms of a playbook that a company will often use is to silo the whistleblowers. So I sort of was hoping we could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I think Theranos is a poster child for an organization that simply it's not surprising they were extraordinarily unfriendly to whistleblowers, because they were based on the sorts of trends that have led to the rise in whistleblowing. Again, a cult of secrecy, cult of the leader, of our noble leader, and don't question that leader. Separating people out in literally silos, so that they cannot compare notes on. Are you seeing the same things I'm seeing from the regulators? Are you convinced that the science here is good? I mean, it was extraordinarily risky, and I think many times these situations don't start off designed to be dishonest, but one tiny little fib becomes a lie, becomes a broken law. As it snowballs, you say, well, we can almost prove that to our, in our investors meeting. So we'll say it, and then we'll get the results in a couple of weeks. And of course, those results don't come. And I think that's what we were dealing with Theranos. But yes, I mean, another issue that you talked about, compliance officers should be the best friends of whistleblowers if they have a direct line to the board, and if the board itself is deeply engaged in ethical behavior. Now, the board of Theranos was a bunch of kind of old military industrial complex folks who really didn't know anything about biotech, and not surprisingly, they were chosen for their clout in Washington rather than their knowledge of the industry. In fact, biotech people wouldn't touch it with a stick for very good reasons. So if the compliance department reports directly to the board and has traction there, and the board is interested in what's going on, that's great. If the compliance officer reports to legal, then the compliance office itself becomes a kind of a whistleblower containment and control device in many cases. In several of the cases that I looked at, the compliance officers were not the best friends of the whistleblowers. They were telling them, they were capturing their information and siloing it off so that it couldn't become an existential threat to the organization.
Pivoting for a minute to another thing that makes Ireland above average is that we are now faced, and they are faced with now transposing the EU directive on whistleblowing protection into their own laws. Ireland already has a very strong law. And the reason I call it out is I think that where there used to be a patchwork quilt, and a very holy patchwork quilt in Europe, where there are only 8 countries with whistleblower protections, we're now going to experience a sea change where all 27 member states have, supposed to be by the end of 2021, we'll see if they get there, but soon have protections that I hope will give whistleblowers more comfort in deciding that it's safe to speak out. So I do think that's something that's coming down the pike for Irish companies, is to have more, with these protections, more robust. And, we have a lot of workers who work, all throughout Europe. You may be working for an Irish company, but you're working in Luxembourg or somewhere where now there will also be protection. So I do think that the result will be an increase in whistleblowing, I think. So one question I have is, we've now said why you should be embracing of whistleblowers. Now I'm going to turn up the heat and get to something very controversial, is what about paying rewards to whistleblowers? And I do want to mention this for this audience because I moved from US to London 3.5 years ago to launch our firm's international whistleblower practice. And what I seek to do is attract foreign whistleblowers to bring their information and bring it to the United States government to empower them to take action. And then if they, and that's what whistleblowers want, right? So the EU directive is looking in the rearview mirror saying you deserve protection for retaliation if it occurs. But the American model tries to say, okay, you need that, we should have those laws, but you also, when you blow the whistle, you want someone to take action. So I think that's where we have seen sort of a heyday in the United States of whistleblowers bringing information to the government and then them acting on it and the whistleblower receiving some percentage. That has been said to be culturally inappropriate in the UK, but I think because Americans are viewed as mercenary, there's a lot of, I bring it up now because I think there's a lot of opposition to it that maybe, needs to be unpacked. But the point is, to an Irish audience, is that there are plenty of whistleblowers in Ireland who bring information to me that if the Irish government, act upon it, they're bringing it to the United States government where there's a nexus to the United States. So I've given you a ton of questions to talk about. What do whistleblower rewards mean? What do they do? Should companies be scared of them? And is it coming to a European nation near you?
I started off 7 years ago when I started looking into whistleblowing with the idea that whistleblower rewards might be some sort of it might in some way tinge the motivations of a whistleblower, and might color their actions or change their actions. I completely changed in the course of my research as I met time and again, case after case. My book was, one reviewer called my book a very interesting, but not a feel-good read. And the fact of the matter is, even whistleblowers that are technically successful in the sense that Walt and Donna averted a nuclear disaster in the Northwest of the United States. Financial whistleblowers, in various banks, unhinging money laundering by the Sinaloa cartel, big pharma whistleblowers, you name it. Even when they are technically successful, even when they have their day in court and win, their careers are typically over, almost without exception. Now, there are times when they can remain anonymous, do their whistleblowing, and continue to work. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule. I was shocked at even, and these are the successful cases. So I went from looking at a whistleblower reward about which most whistleblowers had no clue when they began their whistleblowing. No idea that these provisions even existed. They were doing it because it's the right thing to do, or because they thought this was wrong. But I've now see whistleblowing rewards not as a bounty or dirty money, but quite the reverse, as a compensation for a lost career. Because like it or not, in the world we live in right now, I hope that things will change. I hope that there will be a better solution and a resolution for many whistleblowers. Right now, most whistleblowers risk their career, and most whistleblowers lose their career. So a whistleblower reward is simply a quite often very insufficient compensation for a lost career. It's a lump sum payment for the rest of the work that you would be able to do had you not blown the whistle. And another issue that came up, and originally I thought, motivations. Why are people doing this? Why are they blowing the whistle? At the end of the day, I've come to see that is also misguided. It's a very common phenomenon to obsess about what's going on in the whistleblower's mind. Why did they risk everything to do? The point is, did they or did they not surface good facts in good faith, thinking that these were these were serious matters? If they produce good facts, I don't care why they did what they did. And ultimately, they often don't even know why they did what they did. If they don't produce good facts, they will blow away in a heartbeat. As you've seen, you have to probably do quite a bit of quality control, because if you don't have good facts, all the will in the world is not going to help you against a multinational corporation. So whistleblower rewards are actually compensation for a lost career, not hush money, blood money. And the motivations that drive whistleblowers, whether noble or ignoble or anywhere in between, absolutely do not matter. A.J. Brown, one of my favorite scholars on whistleblowing, an Australian at Griffith University, in an important government report done for the Parliament of Australia, observed that people have surfaced vital information, vital for corporations, vital for the nation, both because they were noble individuals who are doing the right thing, and because they really hated their boss. And I think those are equally valid reasons to come forward if you have good facts.
I agree. I think interestingly, and Garda plays a big role in Ireland, of course. When you talk about should we pay rewards, Garda, the Met Police in London, they all pay rewards to whistleblowers. They call them sources, but in fact, they're whistleblowers. And of course, they come with unclean hands. So I think that that's a really important point that you make, that why is it that we expect whistleblowers to be so devoid of any wrongdoing? Like for the best whistleblowers in the most compromised organizations are by themselves, by definition, compromised. So I just think it's an interesting phenomenon that we hold whistleblowers to either this heroic status or demonizing. And I think that gets to a question about how can we normalize whistleblowing. I would love to get your thoughts, because I think that's where I think all of us would like to be, both my side of the V and at companies. We don't want this to be a life-changing event for a corporation or for the person who exposes it. So how do we normalize it? One of my favorite, and I definitely want your views on that, one of my favorite answers to that question came from a US whistleblower whose name's Charles Middleton, who exposed tax fraud at Walmart. He's still waiting for the IRS to do something with that information, but his response is, one of the ways to normalize whistleblowing is hire a whistleblower. Like nothing says that you value whistleblowers, and not just for compliance. Hire them anywhere in your organization. So I'd love to get your thoughts on how can we move towards the normalization of whistleblowing? What are some of the best means by which to do that?
Well, I think, I mean, stage one is for everyone to do to really understand the basic precepts of social psychology that emerged after World War II, and Stanley Milgram and cognitive dissonance and groupthink. All of these things, Solomon Asch, all of these lessons were very clearly show that we have a deeply human, deep-seated drive towards unity of group, which distorts our individual sense of conscience and our individual sense of justice. And that we all need to, just as we need to be aware of monetary incentives, you know, they have a corrosive effect on almost everyone. And it's not everyone's fault, it's just the way we're wired. So we need to be aware of our own reactions, instinctive reactions to whistleblowers, in order not to follow the whistleblower playbook. We also have to be aware of the types of people who do blow the whistle. And many scholars say there is no whistleblower type, and I think that's probably right. But in the course of my research, and maybe I gravitate to the same sorts of people, but I did run into a number of different types. And one of the key things is these are not life of the party kind of people quite often. They can be difficult, they can be sticklers. They quite often say, I'm a black and white kind of person. This is right and this is wrong. And of course, you know, the life of the party, go with the flow, good soldier people, they're not the ones who are going to blow the whistle. They're too busy going with the flow, right? It's the people who, you know, who don't like it when you play your music in the next cube and complain, right? Or you're not following the protocol. These are the people who may come forward. And we need to embrace that challenge to, you know, the good soldier, the go along to get along kind of personality, which, as the social scientists of the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s have told us, have been behind some of the great catastrophes of humankind. I mean, you know, the reason that people started learning about social psychology in the late 40s and early 50s is Nazi Germany, right? Why did that whole country go insane? Why did my country go insane? Is the question that many social psychologists ask, and the reason is because there were too many go along to get along folks and not enough challengers. So I think that is a fundamental to understand our instinctive reaction to a whistleblower, which is quite often violently against or questioning, and then to understand the whistleblower's perspective of, hey, you know, I'm going to crash this party. This is not something I feel comfortable, you know, going along with. Those are both deeply human, and even whistleblower. I mean, part of the destabilizing process for whistleblowers is they themselves find themselves questioning their own disloyalty, if you will. They're tortured by the fact that the world seems to have turned upside down. They thought they were doing the right thing, and all of a sudden, you know, and am I a snitch, like they say? You know, this. So we have to kind of unpack the deep-seated human drives towards whistleblowing on the one hand, justice and truth, and whistleblower retaliation on the other, groupthink and loyalty to the supreme leader.
Totally agree. I think there's been a number of other ideas floated. And I'm obviously very fond of the Hire a Whistleblower campaign, because you and I have seen the enormous brain drain. It's personally hard to watch someone who received, you know, trained themselves for some of the top careers. There's a famous whistleblower named Raj Mattu in the UK, who's one of the country's top cardiologists. And because he blew the whistle on NHS, we've lost him. Like and that isn't just a loss for him, that's a loss, that's a brain drain for society, right? All of these people that we've sidelined, you know, we need to think about that cost. What has also been said that's interesting is, can we, in a culture within a company, start to signal to our employees by including as part of your annual performance evaluation, your, you know, not your go along, get alongness, but your willingness to raise hard questions? Can we incentivize, can we bonus whistleblowers or somehow tribute them as a way to sort of counter that? So I think that's a lot of the thinking that needs to happen. And I think that I know that a lot of folks, and certainly in the compliance and ethics industry, are trying to get towards to create this sort of cultural shift. But we all know that these whistleblowers don't want to be the outsider. They want to be in the party. They don't want to be the geek. They want to be normalized. And I think that's a really, I think your analogy is a great one, because it shows how deeply ingrained it is for us not to welcome those people. And I think it's really important.
And tone at the top, to come back to, from my big picture, social psychology to mechanics. Hire a whistleblower, you're absolutely right. Have the leaders of the organization show by words and by doing that whistleblowing is important. You need to have the leaders of the organization not, stiff-arm a whistleblower complaint or go silent, or much less do the Les Staley and try to figure out who the whistleblower is, but actually have the leaders of the organization set the tone at the top by saying, this is vital to our success as an organization. So yeah, no, I think that but hiring a whistleblower, this should not be rocket science. And one of the most deeply disturbing parts of my research, and I think to many whistleblowers, is this notion that whistleblowers are not only terminated from their organization, but blackballed in their industry, because in some sense, they can't be trusted. I mean, that is so upside down. I mean, they, in fact, are the ones that can and should be trusted. So yes, hire a whistleblower, put them in a position in compliance. They're able to deal with other whistleblowers. One of the things that I'm sure you've seen, and I've heard it from you, to stabilize the whistleblower, to give them a sense that they're doing the right thing, that things are going to be okay. What do? You put them on the phone with another whistleblower right away. Have them speak with a whistleblower. And I think, you and I have worked independently on this notion of a Mayo Clinic model for handling whistleblower complaints and so on. Each corporation should be able to do some version of that, have a multidisciplinary team of people who understand what whistleblowing is, legally, psychologically, economically, and support that. Because again, you want them inside the tent, not outside shooting darts, right? So yeah, I think there are basic mechanical steps that can be taken in each organization to make whistleblowers front and center in ethical concerns, but also just in day-to-day life.
I love that you raised this notion of what Tom and I are terming the Mayo Clinic model, because it raises a question that I think is important to Irish employers out there, is that my sense is that if you aren't able to take these steps, I think tech may outpace you. You may be forced to it. And so I think there's a lot of us who are looking at the tech now in a couple of capacities. One is that, starting with Sarbanes-Oxley and now moving to Dodd-Frank, and now in Europe, the whistleblowing directive, companies now are mandated to have an internal reporting system. So no longer can whistleblowers not have a clear mandate or remit on where they can submit their claims. That technology for how you submit is becoming really advanced, and is allowing two-way anonymous reporting and lots of things that I think will advance the cause of whistleblowing. There's a famous whistleblower named Sylvain Mansot. He was an Australian whistleblower of a French descent. He started a new company, a reporting company called Whistleblowing, because the old hotlines were that if he were to call that hotline to complain about what he ultimately did complain about, he's a French accented person. So it would be very clear who it was. So I think that the anonymity and the means for allowing people to provide that information anonymously, and then allow the company to maybe engender their trust by having a back and forth, still anonymously, where they maybe engender trust and can get the information forward. So I think that is going to encourage more whistleblowing. But do you want to talk a little bit about sort of what we see as potentially this Mayo Clinic model, or just the way that it could evolve, that we might have a situation in the future like a WikiLeaks or a Tinder for whistleblowers kind of situation?
Yeah, the reason we started talking about it was COVID, and the urgency of surfacing whistleblower complaints around COVID fraud, around health threats to the general public in real time. We don't have time to wait for whistleblower complaints to be filed and agencies to think them over and years to go by. It needs to happen now. So the idea is to put together a group of people, both people who understand whistleblowing, so social psychologists, lawyers who understand the legal framework, economists, a wide range of different journalists who can help to surface the complaint in another way, and work in real time, potentially even prosecutors, work in real time to figure out what is the most effective way for the general good. Because what the whistleblower wants more than anything else, as you've seen, their greatest fear is not that they're going to be retaliated against. Their greatest fear is that they will blow the whistle and nothing will happen. So addressing that concern and saying, look, each whistleblowing scenario is different. We need a group of experts sitting at the same table and comparing notes to figure out triage for how best to proceed with this particular activity. And that's a very exciting model. There are lots of questions, obviously, but I think tech can be an incredibly important tool. And this is a point that I want to bring up. We've danced around the edges of anonymity, but anonymity really is the cornerstone of some of the most successful whistleblower programs. I mean, the SAC whistleblower program. You can. Maybe you should talk about the value of anonymity in these sorts of programs.
Yeah, I think, all of the things we've been talking about today about the repercussions of whistleblowers, that whistleblowers become radioactive, none of that has to transpire if you are able to file anonymously. And so I think that has been a real game changer with the SEC program, is we've had lots of clients who can stay within their organizations undetected and still bring the information and not have it be life-changing. Of course, one of the issues with anonymity, of course, is that's great for wide-reaching frauds like the FX manipulation, things like that, where this is happening in chat rooms and banks across Europe. But if it's the type of fraud where there's only a few of you, you can be anonymous as to the SEC, but your co-conspirators know and
Yes,
will figure out that it was you. So anonymity is great as far as it can take us.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, exactly. It's not a solution, but it could be part of the arsenal of a Mayo Clinic model to figure out, okay, to what extent is the identity of this whistleblower? Because sometimes, Daniel Ellsberg, the fact of who he was gave his allegations immense power. Walt Tamasitis and Donna Bushy, these were not just random people who knew something about what was going on at Hanford Nuclear Reservation. They were highly trained PhD nuclear physicists. Sometimes it is important for the impact of the whistleblowing event for the identity of the person to be made public. And as you say, in many cases, it's impossible to remain silent. I mean, it's impossible to remain anonymous because people will figure it out in a heartbeat, often because you've already surfaced that complaint internally first and gone up on the radar screen. So, but anonymity is another part of, as Europe goes into this, one of the great social experiments, I think, of our times, taking a gold standard whistleblower law and applying it to 26 Brexit member nations, and each with its own social interpretation of what whistleblowers are, with its own memories. I mean, in Italy here, where I live, whistleblower people, the first thing people think of is mafia turncoat. And in Germany, whistleblower rapidly blends with, Stasi informer or Nazi informer. So there are some huge social roadblocks to enacting a law in a way that people trust. And ultimately, that's it, right? Trust, both by the whistleblower and by society and by organizations, is a fundamental part of making this work. It's exciting.
It is exciting. There's a few sort of whistleblowing scandals that big companies had that I think all of us know. We've all read in the papers. There's the Boeing situation where the 737 Maxes have gone down. There's the VW, which emission scandals with emission cheating devices. I think what's really interesting is in all of those situations, there are multiple whistleblowers. There wasn't just one. And I think that frustrates a lot of us in this world to say, well, why couldn't we have heard from them sooner? And that's part of what the rewards seek to do, is to try and tip the balance, because these people aren't blowing the whistle because they want to get money. They blow the whistle because they need to be able to tell their spouse they'll be able to have a potential safety net if something happens. But I think what's so interesting is that it begs the question about collective action. What could happen if we were able to put these whistleblowers together? Because we've talked today about how whistleblowers are siloed and silenced purposefully. And I think that's part of what the technology is seeking to do is, and I've seen it in two places. One was what we call the Callisto Project, which came out of on-campus rape situations where a database, an information escrow, a vault was created for people who, if they experienced sexual abuse on campus, but they didn't feel like they were in a position to report it at that point, they could at least put it in the bank to access it later. But they could also check a box and say, okay, I don't want to report now, but I agree to be contacted again if someone else comes through with the exact same scenario. Then maybe I'll feel bold enough to come forward. So what I think is so interesting, and you look at Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, they will both tell you from Theranos that they both thought they were crazy, and it was when they found each other, I think that is what emboldened them. So I sort of think the future of whistleblowing tech will be ways to put whistleblowers together. I mean, I think that's part of what I do in my business. Very crudely, I'll have a whistleblower come to me with only one piece of the puzzle, and I'll say, I don't think that's going to get the regulators' attention, but is there anybody else in your organization who has a different piece of the puzzle? So I think collective action among whistleblowers is a little bit about, I think, what we're going to see in the future.
Mm-hmm. I think that aggregation of whistleblower complaints into a larger whole, into a pattern of misconduct, is vital. It's the kind of work that you do, and I've been very, very impressed by you and your colleagues gathering that. This kind of work that the ICIJ does in a broader sense of, there's an umbrella organization with very, very good analysts that is receptive to this stuff. So they get the Paradise Papers, they get the Panama Papers, they get the, but you're absolutely right. It's vital also as a safe space for whistleblowers themselves to compare notes and know that they're not crazy. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you one of the classic questions of where you have studied the historical culture and history of whistleblowing in the U.S. in particular. Where do you see whistleblowing going in the next 10, 20 years?
Wow, that's very challenging because, as I finished my book, Trump was getting elected, and it is true that each and every president in the past has been anti-whistleblower because there's just fundamental leadership issues that are challenged by people who step out of line and say, actually, no, and they don't follow the chain of command and so on. But there have been many other times when the legal environment, particularly after Watergate, the legal environment for government and corporate whistleblowers is vastly more supportive. Now, Trump and his cadre, in a very short time, in 4 years, have made an enormous impact. And I was talking earlier about tone at the top. What does the head of an organization do to her, group before her people to show? Well, what does the head of a nation do? The exact nightmare scenario of loyalty and obedience overall, violent and vindictive retribution to anyone who does their job. All of the people, without exception that I know of, who blew the whistle in all the different government agencies against him and within the White House, were doing so in respect of their sworn oath to the Constitution and the American people. They didn't swear an oath to Donald Trump, but he doesn't care. And frankly, the laws, like so many other laws in America, as good as they look on paper, are only as good as the intentions and the actions of the people in charge. So, I think that the U.S., which was for a long time the promised land of whistleblowing and at the forefront, I mean, Europe, the EU, has passed the U.S. by in public whistleblowing for sure with this new whistleblower directive. But I think America needs to take a very hard look at itself and say, all this stuff about whistleblowing, we really need to practice what we preach here. We really need to review how vulnerable and how ultimately attackable and ignorable all of these laws are. I mean, Trump and company have just ignored them for 4 years. So, I wish that the message were better, but I think it's very, very concerning that the tone at the top in America for the last 4 years has been my way or the highway. To heck with all these, even inspectors general, Trump says, oh, COVID relief funds, trillions of dollars. Nah, we're not going to be responsible. We're not going to respect the inspector general's right to vet our handling of money. I mean, it's insane. So I think, frankly, that America needs to look to Europe now and keep up with the Joneses, and there should be a little bit of competitive among whistleblower organizations. Right now, I think the ball has been passed, or the baton has been passed to Europe, and maybe it's time for Europe to lead the way.
That has been part of the fun in being in London, is getting to try and learn more about the European view, and with an eye towards bringing that home to the United States. I think one of the things that all people who've worked in this space are very clear about is that the United States has always been very far behind Europe in whistleblower protection, because we're very siloed and reactive. We have Sarbanes-Oxley, and then we only create laws. We don't have an umbrella law that covers it all, and I think that's one of our biggest challenges. And then vice versa, there's the controversy of, we would like to talk more about how we pay rewards to whistleblowers, and that conversation does not happen easily between Americans and Europeans. So that's one of the challenges. Your book has in its title that it is Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. And I think every generation looks at this and says, this is the most corrupt time that has ever happened. And yet I contrast that when I'm seeing conferences that I attend where they're saying, 2019, year of the whistleblower, 2020, year of the whistleblower. How can we gauge, is there a rising tide of fraud and corruption? Where are we in history, and why did you say it's an age of fraud?
Well, ultimately, I don't think, and I think whistleblowers would be the first to say this, the fact that whistleblowers are so prominent is not a good sign. Again, many of them say, I was just doing my job. I don't even want this title. I don't want these special laws. I just want to be able to do my job. So, they are kind of the canary in the coal mine for an increasing normalization of wrongdoing, frankly. There's an unhealthy interpenetration. I'm talking particularly about the United States, but this, what happens in America, unfortunately, tends to spread. There's an unhealthy interpenetration of public and private, of the contracting mentality, with a consonant loss of sense of public good. There's, again, a rise in the walls of secrecy around organizations that they can justify by competitive motives and legal arguments that really ultimately allow them to go against public good. And although these whistleblower laws are evolving, they're not evolving as fast as the wrongdoing, frankly. And I think that the Trump administration is a symptom rather than a cause of a lot of wrongdoing. I mean, he's done massive amounts of harm, but the reason he got elected was that things had gone so far wrong in previous administrations. So yeah, I think that this is an age of fraud, normalized fraud. Now we call it shareholder value, but it's actually, and that laws are treated as anti-incentives rather than with any moral normative value. And that's broken. That's not the way to run a society. So, and I think that's ultimately, when you come back to whistleblowers, and this is a generalization, but I think they're kind of old-fashioned people sometimes, and many of the ones that I've spent most time with, they grew up in middle class or lower class families. They didn't have much growing up, and they just say, this is wrong. I can't go to. I mean, one of my favorite whistleblowers, Ellen Beckler-Kudens, whom you've met, she said at a certain point, if I didn't blow the whistle, I couldn't put my kids to bed at night. And that, we need to return to, we are not Homo economicus. We are not incentive driven. That's like Skinner and behaviorism. That's not the way humans work. We have a moral side, we have an economic side, we have a creative side. The moral side needs to come back and not be poo-pooed by these neoliberal economists who basically have structured what we have today. So yeah, I think it is an age of fraud. It's also an age of awakening, and hopefully awakening in time to say we really need to do something radically to change this. And it's not going to be a Joe Biden. I mean, you know, we need something radically to change the structure, because after 8 years of Obama, we get Trump. That's a gross generalization, but that's what happened. That's Obama's legacy. So, yeah, it's a challenge. But I think, again, if the world is looking, if the EU is looking, there are a lot of lessons to be learned.
So Tom, we've got under 5 minutes left, and so I want to wrap up by dealing with the most timely topic that we all deal with today, which is the pandemic. So I think we've observed some really interesting trends in the COVID world of an increase in whistleblowing. The HMRC, the UK's tax authority, has said they got a 63% rise in reports of furlough fraud for the furlough program than they've seen before. They have a hotline, fraud hotline. The SEC is seeing a 30% increase in tips that they're getting. So can we talk, what do you think is driving this increase in whistleblowing during the time of the pandemic?
Well, I think it must be in a new alignment of what is important in day-to-day life. And when we're living in a life and death pandemic situation, when wrongdoing can cause not only, you know, economic loss, but death on a substantial scale, and when everyone just has to kind of reset and think about their lives in a different way, looking out of your apartment window at the world. It's a natural time, I think, apart from the fact that there are trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars flowing in that are just sitting ducks for fraud. I think it's a natural time for people to say, okay, I'm going to do the right thing. I spent a lot of time in Milan, and Milan is the outside of the Middle East, a place that I've spent time where people use their horns the most when they drive. They beep at anything. But after the worst of the pandemic in March and in April, straight through June, and then things started to slip back. You drive. First of all, the streets were relatively empty, but no one would blow their horns. There was a sense of a community and of somehow there are more important things than getting to, you know, my next appointment on time. And I think that may be part of why people step forward is, okay, you know, enough. At this time, I need to do something. And again, in many cases, it's healthcare professionals who have an additional level of ethical and moral and legal responsibility to act.
Well, we can certainly agree. Anything that's making the horn stop in Milan has to be a sociological phenomenon.
Definitely. Unbelievable. Yeah.
Well, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you today. I know that our audience is going to have a lot of great takeaways on what we could potentially do, at least have a good psychological profile of who whistleblowers are and what they want. So I'm really appreciative of your time, and hopefully this has been beneficial to all of our integrity at work pledgers, amazing corporations. We appreciate your time.
Definitely. And Mary, thank you. It's a pleasure to continue our conversation. I learned a lot about whistleblowing from you. So it seems appropriate that you ask me a few questions for a change. But yes, integrity at work, thank you very, very much. And I would welcome anyone who would like to ask further questions and continue this dialogue. I'd really welcome contact from folks who watch this.
Thank you, everybody.